Thanks very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you. Congratulations to IFS for pulling together something else, and I would commend this paper, which I think you all got today, but is excellent, and I think Paul and Robin have done a brilliant job on that. But look, it would be a bit dull if we all agreed, wouldn't it? So let me present a different view. One that concurs entirely that NATO has made great decisions previously, really rapidly. And let me also reinforce that point that NATO has made huge progress. But to me, the progress on decision making is simply in creating more process. Over the last 20 years, where there has been a luxury, NATO has created the book, the Bible that Paul showed you earlier. It's created stovepipes, more commands. It's created complexity where there needed to be none. It's looked for military consensus building where there wasn't previously a need. So let me justify some of those comments with 4 points of reference to start with, to set some context. The first point comes from a dinner that I had with 3 NATO ambassadors a couple of months ago. And we were talking about decision making in the NAC. And they said to me, now, you never ever take a motion to the NAC without first knowing exactly what everyone else's position is, without knowing that you get complete concurrence. You cannot afford not to. And on pushing them, I said, does this mean that the NAC is no longer an effective decision for debate? Well, in true diplomatic style, no one would ever cede that point. But they did recognize the point that the reality was that decision-making took place outside the NAC. Perhaps it had done previously, but now useful debate rarely happened there alone. This, perhaps, is the lack of freedom from 29 members as opposed to the original 11. The second point of reference is about timelines, and I'll return to this a little later. But let me just say, I think that the 30, 30, 30, 30, and 30, whatever it is, plan that's out there is rather wonderful from a Russian perspective. Because the Russian perspective and their doctrine, which they explain to you if you ever go to Frunze Academy, and I'm lucky to go across a couple of times a year, is they now know exactly the timeline they work to. They work to a period of finishing operations within 6 weeks. Done. And at that point, they can do the escalate to de-escalate. At that point, they know they will have hit a couple of tripwires. They know they might have hit a few VJTF forces. But they won't have hit any others. Because the point about readiness that comes out from plans is notice to move. 48 hours, notice to move. Not to be in position, notice to move. Others, the intermediate forces that are at 7 days, notice to move, is not to be in position in 7 days. This idea that the Poles fully understand is that when it comes to it, for 6 weeks, they're fighting alone. There may be some tripwires in there, but there's no one else who's coming to their aid in that period. And that's the reality of some military thinkers who understand these differences in timelines. NATO's idea that readiness in 30 days will be enough, and the reality that the Russians know they finish in 6 weeks. That's all they do. And if you look at their moves in Ukraine at the moment, where in the last month they've staged an additional 53,000 armed forces on the borders with Ukraine, they've shifted 250 T-72 tanks from the eastern military district across the other side of Russia to outside of Ukraine, all without really anyone in the West batting an eyelid. You start to see the possibilities that exist. The third point of reference is what Paul referred to, which is that Bible, the NATO OPP, the wonderful process, which is designed to prevent you to make a decision. And anyone who has been through one of these decision-making cycles in NATO as a planning process knows that the whole process is absolutely designed so no one can make a decision. It is the worst of all possible organizational designs. Having taken it to business leaders, and I teach some MBA classes in the UK about strategy, I take them through this process. There is no one ever who would design this themselves. There is no way to get a consensus-built plan out of a NATO OPP. Certainly one that is going to actually meet with any degree of success. The fourth point of reference is Trident Juncture, which I find rather incredible. Planning for Trident Juncture started 6 months before the exercise start. This wasn't an exercise in rapid deployment. This was an exercise in carefully coordinated and orchestrated planned movements. That took 6 months to move that fairly small number of forces, certainly when you compare it in size and scale and ambition to Vostok 18. So where does that leave me? Well, it leaves me with the conclusion that NATO itself is an entirely reactive alliance. It is one that is now unwilling to take preemptive decisions. And this actually flies in the face of everything that actually has happened in the alliance's history. We have recreated since 1996 the idea that the alliance has always been on defensive, that means reactive movement. This is not the case. So we should be worried. But that's not to say this is not without precedent for the alliance. There was previously a period in alliance history where the United States was distracted to a certain amount by the deployment of hundreds of thousands of forces to Asia to fight a war in Vietnam. During this period, the eye was not technologically away from Europe, but intellectually it certainly was. It was during this period that perhaps the greatest naval admiral ever, Admiral Gorshkov, assembled a fleet under the permission of the Kremlin of 550 warships and submarines, 850 coastal offensive craft, and 750 auxiliary and support vessels that were networked together with a high degree of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that gave them control of the North Atlantic and the Arctic. We don't acknowledge this in the alliance history. But if you go back through congressional records, Admiral Zumwalt, another great admiral, gave evidence to Congress in 1974 when he said, quote, "If you ask me to fight a war against the Soviet Union, NATO will lose." We conveniently forget that. That sort of didn't exist in our current memory. We've skewed history to the way we understand it. And that orthodoxy sat in place for 6 years after you made that comment. This idea that you couldn't challenge Russia at sea in the North Atlantic or the High North, because to do so would be provocative. It would risk mass confrontation. And it wasn't until Reagan and to a certain extent Thatcher came in that they decided that this orthodoxy must be overturned. And in 1981, under Secretary of the US Navy Lehman, planned and executed NATO's proper exercise, Ocean Venture 1981. In this, 120,000 troops, 250 warships, 1,000 combat aircraft sortied into the Atlantic, north and south. 61 nations played a part in that. But the pivotal moment happened when 73 ships of the US Second Fleet sailed towards the bastion. That took them through the Norwegian Sea to the point at which everyone believed would be the trigger for Armageddon. They pushed. And the result was an overturning of that orthodoxy of the position. The idea that whilst they might not be technologically able to match the Russian Alpha-class submarines, what they could do was challenge them intellectually, and they did. It's interesting to see what part the NAC played in that, and political decision-making, and there was very little. It was more military, well, should I say militarily led. And those lessons have resonance today. And I'm not saying that neither NATO nor Russia has the kind of forces we saw in Ocean Venture 81. I would also say that I believe the political will is there. Having spoken to those in the Parliamentary Assembly, I don't believe that you will find politicians that shy away from these decision-makings. More worryingly, however, I'm not sure that military leadership seems to exist in its ability to provide military advice. because there are generations that have evolved as military officers, probably many of you sitting here, who have been instructed to provide politically aware military advice. The nuance between these two is actually very important. And it's a distinction that has become so blurred that I'm not convinced many military officers can tell the difference. And it's this division that I think is so worrying. It's this difference that is a failure of professional military education, it's a failure of policymakers, and it's a failure of leadership at the top levels of the military. Militaries rarely now believe in leadership alone, the flash of genius of a commander. They are mostly honed and brought up as a generation that believes in technological determinism. That is to say, a silver bullet will somehow be procured and provide the solution through perfect situational awareness, marrying somehow beautiful, complex artificial intelligence and autonomy. This, to me, does a disservice, not only to the soldiers, sailors, marines and aviators who serve, but also to the general public who expect protection. So this leaves me with a sort of so what. My first point comes from a study of the First World War, which is that process does not make up for decision making, it doesn't improve decision making. And my second point is that no matter the process, the alliance can take decisions. It can take decisions in time, it can take them at the speed of relevance. But my worry is that the caliber of the people won't allow that to happen. I worry that somehow today's leaders, military and political, in many ways, don't live up to their predecessors. Thanks.